Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Well, this is going to be the first full video in the Back to the Basics series that I'm doing, and we're going to talk about first aid. First aid is one of those subjects that can overwhelm you. You could go on and on and on first aid and still not cover everything. So I'm going to try to keep this really short and cover the most common injuries that happen when you're out hiking, out camping, out hunting, something like that. And by most common, what I mean by that, and it's not taken away from any of the other injuries that could happen, it's just what is going to happen most often when you're out like that. So what I'm going to talk about is cuts, scrapes, burns, and just leave it at that, because broken bones, dislocations, you can get into just hours of stuff on all of them. So the whole purpose of this series is to cover just the basics. Most of the time when you're out, you're going to cut your fingers, you're going to cut your hand, may get a cut on your arm or your leg. Scrapes happen a lot. Burns happen, especially if you're cooking. Different things like that happen. So that's why we're going to keep it to the bare minimum. The number one thing to really be prepared for is bleeding. Reason I say that, if you go out there and you get a bad scrape or a bad burn, yes, that's horrible, but chances are, in order for it to cause you serious harm, an infection or something like that's going to have to set up, and that's going to take days, if not weeks. Bleeding, on the other hand, especially a major bleed, 10 minutes, and it could be done and over. Nowadays, there are so many different styles of tourniquets out there and available that it makes sense to carry some kind of tourniquet with you when you go out, especially if you're going to be doing any kind of cutting task, be it with a knife, a saw, an axe, whatever, machete. We're not going to get into which one to carry because opinions vary. Everybody has their own idea of what they think is best. They're not that expensive. Talk to your local fire department, your local EMS. If you have family that has been in the military, talk to them. Chances are they've used several different types and may even have access to those so that you can kind of play with them and see what you think works best for you, because everybody likes things different. So we'll start out with scrapes. The key thing with scrapes, no matter where it's at, is you want to wash it and get it clean right off the bat. Then once you get it clean, if it's bleeding, you want to stop the bleeding. The number one way to stop bleeding is with direct pressure, be it a handkerchief, a piece of gauze, a schmog, something on top of the cut, and just put pressure on it and hold it to stop the bleeding. Once you get the bleeding stopped on a scrape, you want to cover it with something. Again, you can cover it with the same items: a handkerchief, a bandana, a schmog, any kind of bandage, be it gauze with a piece of tape over it, a band-aid, whatever. Cover it with something to keep dirt out of it. Probably one of the ones that's the worst to deal with would be burns, first, second, or third degree. First degree is not as bad as second and third, because second and third, the chances of having an open wound greatly increase. But you want to rinse it with cool water and then try to cover it. The thing with burns, when you cover them, they're going to ooze. So you want to make sure whatever you cover it with isn't going to stick. Sometimes you can't help that. I've had burns to where I've covered it with a bandana, get home, bandana stuck, have to wet it and soak it in order for it to loosen up to where I can get it off. But again, wash it out and then try to keep it clean. Cuts start getting into a little more to it. Depends on where they're at and how much they're bleeding. If you cut a finger or cut your hand, which is what normally is going to happen, the first thing you want to do is rinse it out, just like a scrape or burn. Get it clean. Get all the foreign matter you can out of it, the dirt, whatever, get it out of it, and then you want to control the bleeding. There's a lot of different ways to do that, from just taking your handkerchief and wrapping it around it, pulling it tight and holding it, to actually holding the bandage on your finger and try to get the bleeding stopped. There's so many different ways you can bandage cuts that if I just talked about that, I could spend 30 minutes talking about the different ways of bandaging cuts. The key thing with it is to get the bleeding stopped and then bandage it in such a way to keep it clean and keep the pressure on it. I looked through my Boy Scout manuals, and short, sweet, and to the point. Some of them talk about bandaging. I've got one from 65, I've got one from 72, and one from 79. Out of all of them, the 65 version, or a 65 edition, is the most vague when it comes to first aid. It has 19 pages to cover all of first aid. So it doesn't give a lot of information. The 72 and the 79 give a lot more, and it's pretty much identical. The only thing that's really changed since both of those manuals come out is the use of a tourniquet. Back then, tourniquets were a thing of last resort. Tourniquets, not so much so now. If you can't get the bleeding stopped with direct pressure, there's nothing wrong with going ahead and putting a tourniquet on. I'm not going to get into bandaging, applying tourniquets, and all of that kind of stuff, because like I said, that's going to defeat the purpose of keeping these videos short. There are plenty of videos out there that are made by people who have a lot more knowledge in first aid than I do, and I'll let you go and research that on your own. But the basic things we're going to deal with when we're out are cuts, scrapes, burns, and then we want to control the bleeding. You'll have sprains and broken bones, but not as common. I am 53 years old. I have been in the woods with my father since I was about 6 or 7, and I've had 2 sprained ankles in all those years. I have never broke a bone while I was out in the woods. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but it's just not as common as the cuts, the scrapes, the burns. I cut myself real bad one day out fishing with a fillet knife right across the top of my leg and couldn't get the bleeding stopped. I tied handkerchiefs as tight as I could handle them. Back then, tourniquets weren't as readily available, and the ones that were the old 1/2 inch cloth tourniquets with the big alligator clip on one and you pulled it and got it tight. Didn't have any of those. Couldn't get it to stop bleeding. My dad had taught me and had told me about how to use a fish hook as a sewing needle. I was able to put about 3 or 4 stitches in it myself there on the side of the lake with fishing line and a fish hook, enough that with that on there and the handkerchief tied around my leg, I got the bleeding stopped enough that I was able to get home, and then was taken to the hospital to actually get professional stitches done in it. But things like that are going to happen. You need to be prepared to handle them if you need to. There's all kinds of videos, there's all kinds of literature, there's all sorts of information on all of this stuff out there. So study it, find it, watch it, learn it, be prepared for it. I don't want to keep going on and on with this because, like I said, this could turn from a 10-minute video into an hour, 2-hour video, and I don't want to get into all of that. So we're just going to leave it with what I've covered right now because those are the most common injuries. I hope you found this interesting. Like, share, subscribe. The next one that we're going to get into is going to be knife use and a few basic things with it. I wanted to kind of cover this, like I said in the intro, in order, with first aid being first, knife use being second, and then get into cooking. And this way we're covering all of the basic injuries that could happen as we go through this series. So there you are. Like, share, and subscribe. I'll get another one up for you soon.